Welcome to Focus on Buddhism. Last week we gave a brief biographical sketch of the Buddha. The enlightenment of Prince Siddhartha, which made him into a fully awakened Buddha, was not an inspiration or a revelation. What was this enlightenment? What was this enlightenment which made Siddhartha the seeker say with supreme confidence, "Now I know"? It was the profound realization of the Four Noble Truths, which are the topic of tonight's talk. The Four Noble Truths are a marvellous compact of irrefutable logic which goes far beyond the logic of thought. Thus, to see the validity of the Four Noble Truths, there must be a totally unconditioned state of mind which is not prejudiced in favour or in rejection. As tonight's speaker Bhikkhu Bodhi points out, the whole of the Buddhist teaching is aimed at the realization of these truths, and therefore we will be taking a closer look at this topic, which will be continued next week. Here's Bhikkhu Bodhi.
The Buddha's teaching is called the Dhamma. The word Dhamma has several shades of meaning. In its most basic sense, the word Dhamma signifies the true nature of things. The Dhamma is the fundamental element of lawfulness operating in the universe, structuring all events, all experience, all phenomena. And all actual things, all phenomena, are called Dhammas in the plural, because all of them embody, incorporate the true nature of things. Dhamma also has a practical sense, something applicable to our own life. Dhamma is that which sustains us, which supports us, which upholds our own efforts to live in virtue and goodness. In this sense, Dhamma is the path. The Buddha's teaching is called the Dhamma because this teaching makes known clearly, explicitly, perfectly the true self-subsistent Dhamma, the true nature of things. By way of understanding the Dhamma, we should not take it to be a formulated creed, something that demands to be accepted on faith. Also, the Dhamma shouldn't be taken to be just a system of ideas, a set of doctrines, something to be played about with intellectually. The Dhamma, as we said, is essentially a path, a way that leads to the realization of truth. And Dhamma is also the truth that is to be realized in immediate experience. The Buddha's teaching as the Dhamma, as the formulation of Dhamma, involves a number of doctrines and principles. But these are presented to us not as fixed articles of belief, but as pointers, aids to awaken our own understanding, to bring about an opening of our own eyes of wisdom. The various doctrines presented in the Dhamma come out of the Buddha's own experience of enlightenment, not out of speculation, not out of belief, but out of his own realization of truth. And these same doctrines are presented to us with the aim of leading us to the attainment of enlightenment. The Dhamma is the true nature of things, the truth that's written into our own experience. And to realize this truth, we have to travel the path. But the formulated Dhamma, the Dhamma taught by the Buddha, guides us in our effort to walk the path. It enables us to see, it points out what has to be understood. It doesn't present us with any neat system of ideas to be admired and discussed. It doesn't let us off with easy answers to the ultimate question. What it gives us is basically the method, the way to find the answers for ourselves, the way to make our own discovery of truth. The Dhamma focuses upon the lived immediacy of human life, upon our own lives. It doesn't start off with any kind of theoretical postulates, any dogmas, any creeds to be believed. It begins with an observation, a simple observation, but one very profound, the gateway to all wisdom. This is the observation that human life is essentially problematic, that it's beset with problems, difficulties, inadequacies, what the Buddha calls dukkha, usually translated as suffering. And the value of the Dhamma is pragmatic and instrumental. It offers to show us the way out of our problematic situation, the way to attain inner freedom, to realize the highest and truest happiness. And the Buddha presents the Dhamma as the means to this goal, the method, the way to get from our present state of bondage and suffering, of dukkha, to get across to the other shore, the state of absolute freedom, nibbana, the end of suffering. The Buddha dismisses all purely speculative concerns as irrelevant. He says that he teaches only suffering and the cessation of suffering. And the Buddha's teaching is presented solely and entirely to give us the way to liberation. Now, the recorded teachings of the Buddha are very numerous, but all of these diverse teachings fit together into a single unifying frame, which is completely consistent, completely coherent. This frame is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. In the suttas, the Buddha makes it clear that the realization of the Four Noble Truths coincides with the attainment of enlightenment itself. In his first discourse, spoken to his first 5 disciples, when he sets in motion the Wheel of Dharma, the Buddha says that as long as I did not fully understand and penetrate the Four Noble Truths, I didn't claim in this world that I had reached the supreme enlightenment. But when I fully penetrated the Four Noble Truths, then I could claim that I reached the supreme enlightenment. So the special purpose of the whole Dhamma is to make known the Four Noble Truths. And the special aim of those treading the path to enlightenment is to see for themselves the Four Noble Truths. First noble truth is the truth of dukkha. The term dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but as we'll see, the Pali word has a much deeper meaning than this word. The second truth is the truth of the origin of dukkha, the cause of suffering. And this the Buddha identifies as craving or thirst, the blind, self-centered desire. The third noble truth is the truth of the cessation of dukkha, the end of suffering, which the Buddha identifies as nibbana, the deathless state. And the fourth noble truth is the truth of the path, the way to liberation from dukkha. That is the Noble Eightfold Path. And from this explanation, we can see that the Four Noble Truths actually center around a single theme, a single subject. That is what's called dukkha. Our understanding of the Dhamma hinges upon the way we understand this word. The Pali word dukkha originally meant pain and suffering. And the Buddha sometimes uses it in this limited sense. But the Buddha took this word of common usage and he raised it to a higher level, a philosophical level, where it expresses a deep and comprehensive vision of human existence. And from this perspective, this higher angle, the word dukkha comes to suggest a basic unsatisfactoriness pervading all existence, due to the fact that all forms of life are changing, impermanent, unstable, without any inner core or substance. The term dukkha thus indicates a lack of perfection in experience, a perpetual gap and unbalance between an ideal state we desire and hope for and envisage and the real state of our existence that we have to put up with, a condition that never really measures up to our standards and expectations. Sometimes when we explain the Buddha's teaching, we'll continue to use the common translation suffering, just because this word communicates rather more directly than the Pali word. Other times we'll stick to the Pali. But when we use the English word suffering, we should understand it generally in the deeper, more broader sense given to it by the Buddha. The logic of the Four Truths is exactly the same as the formula a doctor uses to deal with the patient. When the patient comes to a doctor with a certain sickness, the doctor starts off with a diagnosis. That is, he examines the patient, he takes note of his symptoms, and he tries to determine what is the disease the patient is suffering from. This is like the first noble truth. Here the Buddha sets out the basic affliction of human life, the problem of dukkha, suffering. Then, after he makes his diagnosis, the doctor lays down an etiology. He sets out the cause of the disease. This is analogous to the second noble truth. Here the Buddha tracks down the cause of dukkha. He finds it in craving. As a third step, the doctor gives a prognosis. He determines the possibility of a cure, what must be done to remove the disease. This is like the third truth, the cessation of dukkha. Here the Buddha announces, yes, suffering can be ended. Then as a fourth step, the doctor gives a remedy. He prescribes a course of treatment that can remove the disease. This is just what the Buddha does in the fourth noble truth. He prescribes the Noble Eightfold Path. This is the medicine for curing the disease of suffering. Now we will deal with each of the four noble truths individually. And we start with the first noble truth. And in the suttas, the Buddha explains this first noble truth simply by listing the different forms of dukkha. He says, what is the noble truth of suffering, of dukkha? Birth is suffering, old age, aging is suffering, disease is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. To be separated from the pleasant is suffering, to be united with the unpleasant is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates of clinging are suffering. So here we have different forms of dukkha. First, birth. Birth in itself, when it takes place, it becomes a painful experience. Being thrust out from the womb, thrown out into the world, without any choice, without any understanding. This can be a very dramatic experience. And birth is dukkha also, since this is the foundation, the first point, for all the other forms of dukkha that will follow. Then after birth, then growth takes place. Then when the maximum point of growth is reached, then aging sets in. The hair turns gray, the skin wrinkles, the teeth begin to fall out. The sense faculties lose their sharpness. The mind loses its intelligence. Memory grows dimmer. Strength and vitality decline. That's the suffering of old age. Then sickness has various forms, ailments of the body, disease, accidents, injuries, and so on. Ailments of the mind, worry, anxiety, neuroses, psychoses. Then at the end comes death, the breakup of the body, the extinguishing of the life force. Death also a form of suffering. These four items, birth, old age, sickness, and death, these can be called occasional dukkha, since they come only at certain times. Then the Buddha mentions 5 terms which give a kind of overview of the vocabulary of suffering. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Sorrow is intense woe because of some deprivation of some kind. Lamentation, that's crying and weeping. Pain is bodily pain. Grief is any kind of mental unhappiness. Then despair, that's the very lowest point of mental anguish, where all hope is given up. Then the Buddha says, union with the unpleasant is dukkha. Then there's separation from the pleasant. Then the Buddha says, not to get what we desire, that is dukkha, that is suffering. These 3, the union with the unpleasant, separation from the pleasant, and not getting what we want, these can be called frequent dukkha, because we meet them quite often in the course of life. Then the Buddha sums up the whole First Noble Truth. He says, in brief, the 5 aggregates of clinging are dukkha. With this statement, the Buddha indicates that all our experience is included in dukkha. And thus this aspect can be called constant dukkha, continual dukkha. Now we have to understand what are meant by the 5 aggregates of clinging. The 5 aggregates are the basic components of our experience, the basic elements of our existence. We exist as psychophysical organisms, and this organism can be broken down into 5 types of factors. On the one hand, there is the material form. That covers the body, the material body with its sense faculties. That is the physical, the material side of our organism. Then the other 4 aggregates, those cover the mental side. That's the analysis of mind. The mind is analyzed into 4 groups of factors. That is feeling, Vedana, the factor by which we feel pleasure, pain, or indifference. Perception, that's the 3rd aggregate, is perception, the factor by which we take note of the properties of objects. The 4th aggregate is the aggregate of mental formation. That is all the mental acts of volition, of will, the different desires, the emotional states, the habitual tendencies of the mind. Then the 5th aggregate is the aggregate of consciousness, vijnana, the basic awareness of an object. So we have the psychophysical organism made up of these 5 aggregates. And the reason these are all included in dukkha is that they are all impermanent, changing from moment to moment. In fact, they are only events, momentary events without any inner core, without any substance underlying them, lasting through time. What we call myself, my being, is just a combination, a compound of these 5 insubstantial aggregates, changing from moment to moment. And because our being is always changing without any solid substance inside of it, there is nothing we can hold to in our personalities, in our being, as a basis for lasting happiness. Even though we seek security in the 5 aggregates by clinging to them, by identifying with them, we can never find that security. For the 5 aggregates are just a process of becoming. Then, to make it clear that dukkha means more than ordinary suffering, that it has this extended sense. The Buddha explains sometimes that there are three levels of dukkha. The first and most elementary level is ordinary suffering. This is called dukkha dukkata. Dukkha as ordinary suffering. This signifies experienced suffering. And this experienced suffering can be either bodily or mental. Bodily pain stands out most clearly in the cases of accident, injury, sickness, in violent contacts with the body. Then there's mental suffering, mental pain. This has a great range from momentary feelings of irritation and annoyance down through deeper experiences of disappointment, of sorrow, grief, frustration, down to the very deepest experiences of anguish, dejection, and despair. All of these are included as forms of mental suffering. So bodily pain and mental pain, these make up dukkha dukkata. Dukkha in the sense of actual felt suffering. But then we come to the second level of dukkha. And this takes us a step further, a step more removed from felt suffering. This is called dukkha due to change, viparinama dukkata. At this level, we see that all our pleasant experience is really a form of dukkha. The reason is that all pleasant experiences are subject to change. The objects that give us pleasure are impermanent. They don't last. And therefore, the pleasure that we get from them is also impermanent. It has to pass away. So when the objects of attachment pass away, because we cling to them and become attached to them, then the result for ourselves is pain and suffering. But this aspect of dukkha, dukkha due to change, this has to be properly understood. It doesn't mean, as we might think it means, simply that suffering arises through the change of our pleasure. Rather, it means that the pleasant experiences themselves and the things that give pleasure are already dukkha, even while we're enjoying them. And the reason for this is that they're bound to pass away. And because they're going to pass away, even in the immediacy of enjoyment, they're dukkha. The third level of dukkha, this takes us to the deepest implications of the truth of suffering, the first noble truth. This is called Sankara dukkata, the dukkha of conditioned formation. This is the aspect of dukkha the Buddha points at when he says the five aggregates of clinging are dukkha. The conditioned formations are the five aggregates. And these five aggregates, as we just explained, are the elements of our being, of our person. What we identify ourselves with, our individually, is simply a combination of conditioned phenomena, mental and material processes undergoing constant transformations. And these five aggregates function by themselves. We don't have mastery over them. We don't have absolute control over them. We can't govern them according to our will. They go their own way. They're unstable, impermanent, subject to rise and fall. And because they're in this constant process of rising and falling, for one with deep wisdom, they're experienced as dukkha, unsatisfactory.
Buddha's teaching of the First Noble Truth of the inherent unsatisfactoriness of life often tends to arouse a certain degree of emotional resistance. This gives rise to misunderstanding, sometimes to false charges that Buddhists are pessimists. Next week, Bhikkhu Bodhi will look at these ideas in detail and also continue with the other three Noble Truths. We wish to remind our listeners about the one-day seminar on Buddhist philosophy and meditation, which will be held at the Australian Buddhist Library, 2nd floor, 392 Sussex Street, Sydney, on Saturday the 26th of October from 9 a.m. For bookings, phone 797-8085, 797-8085. A month-long retreat conducted by Venerable U Pandita Sayadaw from Burma is being held at Baradu from the 4th of November. For further information ring 042 673240, 042 673240. This program was brought to you by the Buddha Dharma Society of Sydney. May you all be well and happy.